Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Jordan Brasher. Today's date is June 26th, 2026, and I'm going to be talking to you about memories of slavery and the American Confederacy in Brazil. So, quem sou eu na fila do pão? In other words, who am I in the bread line? In Brazil, this is a slang expression used to question someone's importance, relevance, or authority in a given situation. It's similar to asking, who do you think you are, or what makes you so special? It can be playful or slightly mocking, depending on the context, but the idea comes from the imagery of a long line at a bakery where everyone's just waiting their turn to get their bread. So, why would someone think that they're more important than anyone else? In a country with extraordinary inequality, economically, socially, and otherwise, the playing field is leveled while each person waits together in the bread line. So, who am I in the bread line? My name is Jordan, and I use he, they pronouns. In my day job, I work at the Minnesota Department of Transportation in the United States. And I also teach part time in geography, human geography especially, and geographic information systems. I'm a human geographer by training. I sometimes call myself a critical human geographer because I'm interested in questions of power, authority, memory, public space. And I'm originally from Milan, Tennessee. I've been teaching and writing about Brazil since 2017, and I did my doctoral fieldwork in an area about 2 hours outside of Sao Paulo, in an area with a fascinating history that I hope to share a little bit about that with you today. So let's get a little context for what I'm going to talk about today. Of the roughly 12 million Africans trafficked in the transatlantic slave trade, almost half, about 5.5 million people, were forcibly taken to Brazil as early as 1540 and until the 1860s. This is nearly 10 times as many people as were brought to the United States during the transatlantic slave trade, and a majority of them came through the port of Salvador da Bahia. For this reason, Salvador is an icon of Black Brazilian culture today and carries with it both the heavy and disheartening legacy of the brutality of race based chattel slavery, as well as the vibrant and resilient Black culture, which has been influenced by and borrowed from the cultures, foodways, and religious practices of European settlers and the indigenous people of Brazil. Slavery lasted until 1888, around which time Brazil was desperately trying to quote unquote catch up socially, economically, and politically with the rest of the world, especially with Europe and the United States, which many elites in Brazil believed at the time should be the model for the post slavery society. Brazilian Emperor Dom Pedro II thought that incorporating formerly enslaved people into the free workforce, though, would not work, that the country should whiten itself instead by attracting paid labor from outside of Brazil, from quote unquote whiter countries. So, thus, an era of embranquecimento or whitening took hold. And whitening was a strategy used by many Latin American countries, not just Brazil, to make the population whiter, which was commonly held as the racist ideal standard for beauty, progress, modernity, and ultimately productivity. Whitening also involved attempting to marry lighter skinned people, as depicted in the famous Redemption of Ham painting in this slide from the post emancipation era. The painting alludes to the story of Ham, Shem, and Japheth in the biblical book of Genesis, in which a drunk and naked Noah is exposed by his son Ham to his brothers. For bringing shame upon him, Noah condemns Ham to slavery along with his son Canaan, who is cursed as quote unquote a servant of the servants. Believing that Ham was the supposed father of the dark skinned African race, European Christians in the 16th and 17th centuries used this as their basis for justifying racist and slavery systems in colonial economies. Only this painting by Spanish born Brazilian Modesto Brocos actually turns the curse of Ham on its head. The Black grandmother on the left is seen celebrating the whitening of her daughter and grandchild through racial intermarriage with white Europeans, including the very pleased father of her grandchild sitting cross legged on the right side of the painting. We can use the context of this painting as a departure point for understanding the politics of Confederate migration to Brazil. In addition to racial intermarriage, Brazilian elites even promoted via financial incentives for the immigration of people considered white to Brazil, such as the Japanese, who migrated in large numbers in the early 20th century and took up low paying work in Sao Paulo's coffee plantations. Defeated Confederates from the USA, who had just lost the American Civil War, were among those offered money and land to migrate, settle, and ultimately whiten the area alongside Japanese and other Americans. I should say Japanese and Europeans, other Europeans. From many of the defeated Confederates' perspective, facing the possibility of Reconstruction, the incorporation of the formerly enslaved into Southern life and politics, was simply too much. Many chose to pack their bags and go elsewhere. This Confederate exodus from the U.S. South is the largest outmigration of Anglo descended people in American history. Ex Confederates ended up in places like Mexico, Cuba, Honduras, Peru, Chile, and Venezuela, all across Latin America. But the largest and most long standing Confederate settlement is located in rural Sao Paulo state in the vicinity of Santa Barbara do Oeste and Americana, where I lived in 2018 and 2019 and conducted the field work for my doctoral dissertation, which is the subject of our discussion today. Here's a map sort of giving you a little context for where Santa Barbara do Oeste and Americana are located as sort of sister cities right next to each other. You can see them in the upper left corner of the map in relation to this gray urban area of Sao Paulo in the lower center part of the map. Just for some context, it's about a 2-hour bus ride from Santa Barbara do Oeste to Sao Paulo. Brazilian political economist Cílio Antonio Alcântara Silva analyzed letters sent to Brazilian consulates and vice consulates in the United States at the end of the Civil War and found that 74% of Southerners writing those letters inquiring about immigration were slave owners. At the time, only 25% of white Southern households owned slaves. That means that the people interested in moving to Brazil in the 1860s and writing these letters to the consulate were disproportionately represented a relatively small slaveholding slice of the free Southern white population. Because the exact number of Confederate families that migrated to Brazil is not known, it's impossible to state with certainty how many rejoined the slave trade upon arrival. But Silva's research finds records of at least 54 different Confederate families that purchased in total 536 enslaved Africans in Brazil. The Brazilian historian Luciana da Cruz Brito has also found evidence in the 150-year-old Confederate journals she dug up that slavery attracted white Southerners to Brazil, even though the transatlantic slave trade had been abolished by 1850 by the British. In one journal, an American named Charles Gunter wrote about his desire to purchase enslaved people in Brazil at a lower price than he could in the U.S. Another Confederado, James Gaston, expressed disappointment that he could not bring recently freed African Americans to Brazil in a letter. Legend has it that Colonel Asa Oliver, a Confederado and enslaver, noticed an enslaved person taking potatoes from his farm, attacked and fought with him, and was beaten to death with a garden hoe. What is not legend, though, is the following. 2 Confederado enslavers in Rio do Peixe, Sao Paulo, lynched a police chief who, just prior to abolition, refused to chase down and recapture recently escaped fugitives from slavery. Powerful slave-owning farmers, together with former American Confederate soldiers and their henchmen, carried out an attack on the home of Joaquim Firmino, who was brutally lynched in front of his wife and children. The incident prompted the city to change its name to Itapira in 1890 to distance itself from the national shame the lynching brought upon the city. The incident is chronicled in the recent book O Crime da Penha, or The Crime of the Rock, depicted there on the right side of the slide. So let's talk a little bit about the politics of remembering the Confederate migration. In 1954, a group of Brazilian Confederate descendants formed a fraternity to keep the memory of the migration and their ancestors alive. This organization began to drive local public memory surrounding the Confederate presence in the area, founding both the Festa Confederada, Confederate Festival, and the Museum of the Immigration, which depicts the migration of the Confederates to Brazil in the 1980s, as Brazil began a process of democratization after a brutal 20 plus year military dictatorship. The museum, housed in an old prison building, depicted in the upper right corner of the slide, uh, was built the same year that the redemption of Ham painting was completed, but that only opened as a museum in 1988. It receives thousands of visitors per year, including school children from the local area. It has a small staff with only an archivist, an art educator, and an administrative assistant, at least at the time of my visits in 2018 and 2019. The art educator typically gives tours to curious visitors and school children. And when I met with her, she was hesitant to participate in an interview with me and admitted openly that the perspectives of Afro descended Brazilians are largely absent from the museum. I found only one depiction of an enslaved person in an unlit corner of the museum. The person was unnamed and is circled with a red circle on the slide, and labeled only as escravo, or slave. When I asked her about the image, she turned to me with a nervous chuckle and asked in return, "Do you prefer Obama or Trump?" I think she was a little nervous to give me her honest answer that we don't know too much about this person or their experience. And frankly, the museum hasn't tried to treat it with much historical sensitivity. The museum, for its part, draws thousands, the festival, for its part, depicted in the lower image of the slide, draws thousands to the rural cemetery where original Confederate settlers, such as Colonel Oliver, who owned the cemetery land, are buried, and the first Baptist church ever established in then Catholic dominated Brazil sits. You can see it in the background of the bottom photo behind the obelisk Confederate monument. When I attended the festival in 2019, I watched the presentation of the flags of the Confederate States by young men in gray uniforms and women in yellow bell hoop skirts like those worn by the erudite debutante class of planters and plantation owners of the antebellum era American South. I ate fried chicken, heard renditions of Johnny Cash, Alan Jackson, and Alison Krauss, and met festival goers, many of whom would allow me to ask them questions about what they knew about the Confederate migration and the meanings attached to the symbol. In my research, I also came across this photograph from a Portuguese language edition of National Geographic that was published in 1980, showing the earliest known evidence, at least that I can find, of a Confederate heritage related or Confederate memory related gathering in Brazil. From 1980 until about 2018, this Confederate festival happened almost annually without much fanfare, and I could find no evidence of public pressure or protest during this time of the use of the symbol. However, Heather Heyer's murder in August of 2017 at a Confederate monument counter protest in Charlottesville, Virginia, would change that. The very next month in September, local black movement, the local black movement in the Santa Barbara do Oeste area hosted and recorded a public debate with the festival organizers of the Confederate Festival to express their concerns. And feeling like those concerns were not really heard, the 2018 festival, the following year, a small number of people from the Black movement staged a protest depicted in this image, a protest at the festival over its use of Confederate iconography, invoking the memory of Zumbi and Dandara dos Palmares. As you can see in the image, the sign says, translated by me, "For Zumbi, for Dandara, for us, long live Black consciousness." I had the opportunity to ask Claudia, a history teacher and leader of the group pictured in the center, why invoke the legacies of Zumbi and Dandara dos Palmares? She replied, "This is the motto of our struggle, the essence of our struggle, for freedom. Freedom to tell our history, to have our history, that our children and our youth can know this history. History books do not treat the history of these people. The purpose of the protest was, according to one protester interviewed by a local news station, to challenge both the festival organizers and the attendees to remember that a lot of Black people's blood was spilled, quote unquote, under the Confederate symbol. The Black movement has maintained in every public statement and to me in each interview I conducted that they were never against people gathering to celebrate their ancestors. Black people in Brazil know all too well what it's like to not be able to celebrate their own ancestors. As recently as the military dictatorship period of 1964 to 85, in which celebrations of Black musical, dance, and cultural traditions were strictly surveilled and even censored. They insisted, the members of O Negro, the Black movement, insisted that celebrations should be done instead with respect for history and the suffering that their neighbors experienced under the banner of the Confederate flag being celebrated. In 2019, the crowd of protesters at the annual festival grew much larger, and I had the opportunity to witness that in person. In addition to hoisting signs, Black Brazilians engaged in forms of joyful protest and resistance, such as beating traditional African drums and practicing capoeira. Capoeira, for those who may not know, is a combat game developed by enslaved Africans and Brazilian born Blacks on the streets and squares of port cities in late colonial Brazil. Prohibited from celebrating their cultural customs or practicing any martial arts, enslaved Africans in Brazil developed capoeira as a way to disguise forceful kicks as passionate dance moves, emerging as a tool of survival, self defense, and cultural identity. This image gives a little more perspective on the size of the protest crowd in 2019, about 10 times larger than it was the previous year. Note also the hand painted sign in the middle of the image that says, from my translation, take down the Confederate flag. Don't hoist hate. The 2020s have ushered in a new era of commemoration for the festival, shaped by both the worldwide COVID pandemic as well as geopolitical turmoil over the global Black Lives Matter movement. In 2020, the festival, again, usually held in April, was canceled due to the COVID pandemic. In 2021, a local city council member proposed a new law that would ban Confederate and other iconography considered to, quote unquote, support movements or institutions identified with racist or segregationist ideas. Esther Moraes, the council member, noted in a public meeting, quote, everyone has the right to commemorate their ancestors, but they should do it with respect for the history of other people and the descendants of slavery, end quote. Closed door debates and public hearings followed this proposed new law, and in February 2022, the Fraternity of American Descendants hosted the son of Brazil's then president, Jair Bolsonaro, a far right ally of Donald Trump. Following his private tour of the group's museum, Eduardo Bolsonaro accused leftist critics of the Confederate Festival of, quote, rewriting memory. The new law was approved after his visit later that year in 2022, and in 2023, the festival does not happen at all in observance of the new law. During this time, the fraternity who normally organizes it began to regroup and rethink how they can continue some sort of gathering while still obeying the new law prohibiting them from using the Confederate iconography. In 2024, a gathering of descendants took place at the usual Confederate cemetery location, but without ticketed public entry, without music, and largely without the Confederate symbol being displayed. Here's a photograph of President Bolsonaro's son, Eduardo, receiving a tour of the museum in February of 2022. And here's a photo of what the event looked like that took place at the Confederate Cemetery in April of 2024. This rebranded picnic, more of a family reunion style, not open to the public, not a ticketed event without all the performances, just mainly a gathering of descendants in 2024. As far as I know, nothing happened in 2025. I don't think that there was an event at least not one that was advertised publicly. If there was one, it probably looks something like this image from 2024. However, in 2026, the fraternity announced that the festival would be coming back, the public event, the ticketed event. But to comply with the new law against hate symbols, the festival has been rebranded from Festa Confederada to Festa dos Americanos. So instead of using this explicit Confederate name, they're calling it basically the American Festival. And instead of happening in April, traditionally during Confederate Heritage Month, when the festival has historically taken place, it'll now be on July 4th and commemorate the 250 years of American independence. A representative of the fraternity that organizes the festival noted in a local news article that they underwent, quote, a period of reflection on how to best represent the history that they want to preserve, end quote. They went on to say that they understand that the Festa dos Americanos expresses with more clarity the event's focus on the immigration, on descendant families, and on the cultural and historical dimension of the region's trajectory. Quote, the history will be presented with more context and attention to its historical character. Our interest is in preserving the memory of the immigration, of the families, of the cemetery and the chapel, and the presence of these descendants in the region, with care that this narrative be produced in a respectful way and contextualized to everyone involved. End quote. The representative was again quoted as saying, every change generates a period of adaptation, which is natural. But we understand that this edition of the festival represents a maturation of the festival and a return to its essence. The expectation is that the public understands this memory as a marked recapturing of memory, culture, and is an opportunity to spend time together and reunite. End quote. Now, these are fancy words coming from the festival organizers, but what does this change really mean? Is the passing of the new law and the rebranding of the festival a victory for public memory, for left cultural activism, for the descendants of slavery? How much does this symbolic change impact the lived material realities of the descendants of slavery in the region? These questions are not really answered yet. And I think, some of it probably depends on the way that the festival is treated, the ability or willingness or lack thereof of the festival to acknowledge what's happened in the past and how they have maybe harmed or hurt the descendants of slavery, offended the descendants of slavery in some way with their actions, and whether they're taking any meaningful steps to repair that relationship with the descendants of slavery in the community. Is removing the symbol and replacing it with, for example, the American flag enough? Is it something that the descendants of slavery are going to continue to care about? Or do they sort of feel like, now the symbol is gone. Let's move on with our lives. Let's focus on material issues that affect our ability to feed our families and live happy lives. I don't know. These are questions that I have. These are questions I think are not answered yet. But it's interesting to me to see the way that the festival has undergone this period of political pressure, this passing of the new law, this period of not having the festival, and then transforming and changing it into some slightly different kind of event that no longer uses the Confederate iconography, but perhaps still romanticizes life in the antebellum American South by having, will they still, for example, have the Confederate soldiers in gray uniforms that do the presentation of the Confederate flags, Confederate states flags, I should say? Will they still have the women in the yellow bell hoop skirts, which I think also perhaps romanticizes the antebellum era, the sort of debutante aristocracy? I don't know. That festival hasn't happened yet at the time of this recording in 2026, and it'll be interesting to see what comes from it. If you want to read more about my research on how a small Brazilian town became an unlikely battleground over Confederate memory, you can find this article on theconversation.com. or you can reach out to me, Jordan Brasher at jpbrasher1@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening to what I had to share with you today. That's all for now.